All right, buckle up, everyone, because today we're diving headfirst into a concept that'll really stretch your perception of, well, pretty much everything. We're talking about the idea that reality itself is constantly being reassembled, like some kind of cosmic Lego set that's always in motion.
Yeah, it's a pretty wild idea, isn't it? What if instead of this solid, static world we think we live in, everything is actually being continuously deconstructed and rebuilt like every single moment?
Like the universe is hitting the refresh button a trillion times a second, but
Right.
instead of just reloading the same old thing, it's actually creating something entirely new each time. So where do we even start with something like this? I mean, looking at our sources, it seems like we're going to be pulling from quantum mechanics, general relativity, even thermodynamics to try and unpack this.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the key starting point is really understanding that the universe, at its most fundamental level, isn't made up of static things. It's all about dynamic processes, energy interactions, constant change. So instead of asking what is something, we need to shift our thinking to how is it becoming?
So less about the pieces and more about how they're constantly being rearranged.
Yeah.
That makes sense. And one of our sources uses the example of sound to try and illustrate this whole reassembly thing. I'm kind of intrigued. But how does something as simple as hearing connect to all of this?
Well, think about what sound actually is at its core, right? It's vibration.
Hmm.
When something vibrates, it creates these disturbances in the medium around it, air, water, even solids. And those disturbances, they travel as waves.
Right, like when you throw a pebble into a pond, you see those ripples spreading out.
Exactly. But here's the thing. Those waves, they aren't actually this smooth, continuous flow. They're made up of these distinct compressions and expansions of the medium. It's a constant push and pull, a back and forth reconfiguration of the particles.
So what you're saying is without this constant reassembly, there wouldn't even be sound. We'd all be living in a silent movie.
Exactly. Hearing, the way we experience it, relies entirely on those discrete vibrations, those tiny little packets of energy hitting our eardrums, and them being interpreted by our brains. Without that constant deconstruction and reconstruction, there would be no distinct vibrations, no sound waves at all.
Wow, okay. That's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it. It really makes you realize how much we just take for granted about how reality actually works.
Yeah.
And this reassembly idea, it's not just happening with sound waves, right? Our sources suggest it's happening at the quantum level, too, with the very building blocks of matter.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. When we zoom into the subatomic world, this concept of reassembly gets even more, well, kind of bizarre. Quantum mechanics tells us that those tiny particles that make up everything around us, they're not these solid little balls like we might imagine. They're in this constant state of flux.
So even though I feel solid and static, I'm actually this swirling mass of quantum particles in constant motion. It's like my body is playing a never-ending game of musical chairs at the subatomic level.
Haha, that's a great way to put it. Because their positions, energy levels, even their fundamental nature is constantly shifting and changing. They never settle into this fixed, definite form. And that's where things start to get really interesting.
You're talking about the wave-particle duality, right? That whole mind-bending concept where these tiny particles can behave like both waves and particles at the same time.
Exactly. It's like they're constantly flickering between these two states, never quite settling into one form or the other. It's a constant process of being recreated and reconfigured.
Okay, hold on. I need a second to catch up here. So if we're constantly being reassembled at this quantum level, what does that even mean for our sense of self? Like, is the me of this moment different from the me of a second ago?
Now, that is a profound question, and it's one our sources really dig into as well. It really challenges the very notion of a fixed, unchanging self. Like, if we're constantly in flux, how do we maintain any sense of continuity? What does it mean for our identity, for our understanding of who we are?
Okay, yeah, I'm going to need a minute to wrap my head around that one. But before we get too deep into the existential stuff, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, the idea of traveling without moving. Now, that really piques my curiosity. How is that even possible?
Well, this idea is connected to the concept of space-time itself being in a state of constant reassembly, which brings us to Einstein's theory of general relativity. Remember how we talked about sound waves needing a medium to travel through? Well, in a way, space-time acts as the medium for gravity.
Okay, I'm following so far.
Hmm.
But how does gravity connect to space-time being reassembled? It feels like we're about to jump down another rabbit hole here.
Imagine for a second a bowling ball sitting on a trampoline. The ball creates a dip, a curvature in the trampoline surface.
Right, and the heavier the ball, the deeper the dip.
Now replace the bowling ball with a star or a planet and the trampoline with space-time. These massive objects, they actually create curvatures in the very fabric of space and time.
So you're saying gravity is essentially space-time being warped.
Exactly. But here's where the reassembly comes in this warping. It's not a static thing, it's continuous and dynamic. As objects move and interact, the fabric of space-time is constantly being reconfigured.
Hold on. So even if I'm sitting perfectly still, the space around me is constantly shifting and changing because of the gravitational influence of everything around me.
That's one way to think about it, yeah. We're always in motion relative to something else, and that relative motion, combined with the presence of mass and energy, it causes these constant shifts and reconfigurations in the fabric of space-time.
So traveling without moving could be our experience of this constant reconfiguration of space-time, even when we think we're stationary. It's like we're on a cosmic cruise ship, but instead of the ship moving, it's the ocean itself that's constantly changing shape around us.
Haha, I like that analogy. And it really does raise some interesting questions. What does this mean for our understanding of motion and movement? If the universe is constantly recreating and reconfiguring us and space-time itself is in constant flux, are we ever truly not traveling, even when we seem to be standing still?
Okay, my mind is officially blown. I think we've covered a lot of ground here, but it feels like we're just scratching the surface of this whole reality reassembly concept. There's so much more to unpack, especially about how it all relates to our sense of self and identity. But where do we even go from here?
Welcome back to our deep dive into reality's constant reassembly. And before we went down that rabbit hole of traveling without moving, we were grappling with how all of this constant change affects our sense of self.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in, to be honest. I mean, if our bodies, our memories, even our sense of selves are always in flux, then who are we really?
Yeah.
It's like trying to hold on to water, you know? The harder you squeeze, the more slips through your fingers.
That's a great analogy. And actually, some of our sources suggest that this perception we have of a continuous self, like a stable identity, may actually be an illusion.
An illusion. Wait, are you saying like a magic trick our brain is playing on us? But if that's true, why would our brains even construct this illusion of a stable self in the first place?
Well, think about it this way. In a reality that's fundamentally in flux, our brains need some way to create order and continuity. This illusion of a stable self, it's what allows us to navigate the world, form relationships, make sense of our experiences.
So our brains are basically taking all this chaotic, constantly changing quantum reality and weaving it into a coherent narrative of me.
Mhm.
That's wild. But if it's all an illusion, does that mean our sense of self is, like, meaningless?
Not at all. It just means that our sense of self is much more dynamic and fluid than we might traditionally think. It's an emergent property of this constant reassembly, a pattern that arises from all the underlying change.
So even though the individual pieces are always changing, the overall pattern, like the shape of me, remains relatively consistent.
Exactly. And this pattern, it's not just limited to our physical bodies. It extends to our memories, our experiences, our relationships, everything that contributes to who we are. It's kind of like a river. It's constantly flowing and changing, but somehow it maintains this recognizable form.
I love that. But it does raise another question. If everything is in flux, how do we hold on to memories? Like if our past selves are constantly being erased through this reassembly process, how do we learn? How do we grow?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting. Some of our sources suggest that memory might not work exactly the way we traditionally think. Instead of storing static information like a computer hard drive, our brains might be reconstructing memories on demand, almost like accessing a streaming service instead of pulling out an old DVD.
So every time we remember something, we're not actually accessing this fixed, unchanging memory, but rebuilding it based on the current state of our brain and our understanding of the world.
That's the idea, yeah. And each time we recall a memory, it might be subtly different, reconfigured based on our current perspective, our emotions, even our environment.
That's both fascinating and kind of unsettling to think about. It means our memories aren't these perfect recordings of the past. They're more like interpretations colored by our present selves.
Exactly. It challenges this whole idea of a fixed objective past and suggests that our memories, like everything else in this reassembling reality, are constantly evolving, being reshaped by our present experiences.
Okay, but if our memories, our identities, even our physical bodies are constantly being reassembled, where does that leave free will? I mean, are we really making choices, or are we just along for the ride puppets of this cosmic reassembly process?
Well, that's a question that's been debated for centuries, and the idea of constant reassembly certainly adds a whole other layer of complexity. But one perspective that our sources offer is that free will might not be about absolute control, but about navigating the possibilities within this dynamic, ever-changing reality.
So it's not about dictating every single outcome, but choosing which paths to explore within the flow of this constant reconfiguration.
Precisely. It's like we're surfers riding the waves of this reassembling universe. We can't control the ocean, but we can choose how we ride those waves, how we adapt and respond to the constantly changing conditions.
I love that analogy. It implies that even within this constant reassembly, there's still room for agency, for making choices that shape our experience. But it makes me wonder, what's driving all this change? Like, why is the universe constantly hitting the refresh button? Is there a purpose behind this relentless reassembly?
That's a really great question, and one of our sources points to a pretty fundamental principle that underpins this whole process: entropy.
Entropy, right. That's the concept that everything tends toward disorder, right? But how does that even connect to this reassembly idea? It seems kind of counterintuitive.
Well, it's a common misconception that entropy is just about things falling apart, but actually entropy is about systems moving towards states of greater complexity and diversity. It's about the universe constantly exploring new possibilities, new configurations. Think about it like this: a perfectly ordered system, like a brand new deck of cards arranged by suit and number, is very low entropy. But as you shuffle that deck, you're introducing more possibilities, more randomness, and therefore higher entropy.
So are you saying that this constant reassembly, the shuffling of the cosmic deck, is actually a way of increasing complexity, creating new and more intricate patterns? It's not just about change, it's about growth and evolution.
Exactly. It suggests that this process isn't random chaos, but rather a creative force, driving the evolution of the universe from the smallest particles to the largest structures.
Wow, this completely changes how I think about entropy. But it also makes me wonder about what it all means for us. If we're part of this ever-evolving, constantly reassembling system, are we just passive bystanders, or are we active participants in this cosmic dance?
That's a question we'll dig into even more in the final part of our deep dive. But before we get there, I want to touch on one more fascinating concept that ties directly into the idea of reality being in constant flux: the idea of geometric projection.
Geometric projection. Okay, now we're getting into some serious science fiction territory. What does that even mean?
It's a really mind-bending concept, so bear with me here. Imagine a shadow for a second. It's a two-dimensional representation of a three-dimensional object, right? It contains information about the object, but it's not the object itself.
Okay, yeah, I can visualize that.
Now, imagine that our three-dimensional reality is like a shadow, a projection of a higher dimensional reality that we can't directly perceive.
Whoa, hold on. You're saying there's this hidden dimension out there casting a shadow that we experience as reality. That sounds like something straight out of the Matrix.
It does, doesn't it? But there are actually some pretty intriguing theories in physics that suggest reality might be more holographic than we realize. And if reality is a projection, then that constant reassembly we've been talking about, it might actually be happening at the level of this deeper hidden dimension.
So the changes we see in our 3D world are just reflections of changes happening in this higher dimensional realm. It's like we're watching a movie projected on a screen. The images, the movements, the changes are all happening on the screen, but the source, the projector itself, is hidden from view.
That's a perfect analogy. This idea of a holographic universe is a pretty fascinating way to think about how this whole constant reassembly of reality might actually work.
This deep dive has been quite a journey, that's for sure. We've gone from quantum jitters to the cosmic dance of space-time, the nature of the self, and now this holographic universe idea. I definitely need a moment to catch my breath and process all of this before we jump into the final part of our deep dive. So where will our exploration take us next? Welcome back, everybody. I gotta say, my head is still spinning a little bit from all those mind-bending concepts we've been exploring. From quantum particles to holographic universes, it's definitely clear that reality is much more dynamic and mysterious than we tend to think.
Yeah, it really challenges a lot of our conventional ways of thinking. But as we wrap up this deep dive into reality's constant reassembly, I think it's important to come back to that question we left off with. Are we just passive bystanders in this cosmic dance of change, or do we actually have an active role to play?
Right, because if reality is constantly reassembling itself at every level, like, what does that mean for us as conscious beings? Do we have any agency in this whole process, or are we just along for the ride?
Well, the sources we've been looking at offer some pretty interesting perspectives on that. One of the key ideas is that consciousness itself, it might not be this fixed entity, but rather an emergent property of this constant reassembly. It's a dynamic process, a flow of awareness that arises from the interaction of these ever-changing patterns.
So instead of thinking about consciousness as a thing, maybe we need to think of it as more of a verb, like this continuous unfolding that's intricately connected to the reassembly of reality itself.
Exactly. And that raises some fascinating questions, like what are the underlying mechanisms that actually allow consciousness to emerge from this interplay of matter and energy? How does our awareness, our subjective experience, arise from this constant dance of reconfiguration?
It's almost like consciousness is this symphony,
Yeah.
this grand orchestration that arises from reality being reassembled at every level.
Hmm.
And as conscious beings, we're not just audience members listening to the music, we're actually active participants in this cosmic performance.
That's a really powerful way to put it because, our choices, our actions, our thoughts, even our intentions, they all influence the reassembly of not just ourselves, but the reality that surrounds us. We're constantly interacting with this flow of change, shaping it and being shaped by it in this continuous feedback loop.
So we're not just passengers on this cosmic roller coaster, we're actually co-creating the ride as it's happening.
Exactly. And that realization, it comes with a pretty profound sense of responsibility, don't you think? Because if we're active participants in this constant reassembly of reality, then our choices, our actions, even our thoughts, they have this ripple effect that extends way beyond our individual selves.
It's a pretty humbling thought when you really stop and consider it, to realize that we're not separate from this flow of change, but actually interwoven with it, like at the most fundamental level.
It definitely shifts our perspective on who we are and our place in the universe. Instead of seeing ourselves as these isolated individuals, we can start to understand our interconnectedness with everything around us.
This deep dive has been a wild ride for sure, and I'm left with this sense of, I don't know, awe and wonder at the sheer complexity and dynamism of reality. But it's also given me this sense of responsibility, a realization that we each have a part to play in this ongoing reassembly of the universe.
I think that's a fantastic takeaway from our exploration. And it brings us to a final kind of provocative thought for our listeners to ponder. If reality is constantly reassembling itself, if the you of right now is a reconfigured version of the you from just a moment ago, then, well, what does that mean for the continuity of your experiences and your sense of self?
That's a question that'll definitely stick with me. And I really encourage all of you listening to consider this as well. How does this whole idea of constant reassembly change the way you see yourself, the world around you, and your place in this ever-evolving and endlessly fascinating universe? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.